My parents want me to bail out my estranged sibling, but they disowned me years ago. When I was a kid, life was simple. I was the firstborn and, for a while, the only child in my family. My parents weren't overly doting, but they showed love in their own way. I wasn't particularly smart or gifted, just a regular kid. My grades were average, I wasn't a star athlete, and I didn't shine in extracurriculars. But back then, my parents still supported me and cheered me on. That all changed when I turned 10. My mom announced she was pregnant, and the excitement in our house skyrocketed. My little brother, Nick, was on the way. I remember being thrilled. I was going to have a sibling to play with and look after. When Nick was born, the joy in my parents' eyes was indescribable. At first, I didn't mind that their attention shifted to him. After all, he was a baby and needed more care. But as months turned into years, their love for me seemed to vanish. My accomplishments, however small, were overlooked. Everything I did paled in comparison to the golden child, Nick. Even things like my school projects or the one time I managed to score a goal during a soccer match didn't warrant more than a half-hearted, "That's nice, Kelvin." I remember one Christmas vividly. I had spent weeks making a handmade gift for my parents. A photo album filled with drawings and pictures of our family. I thought they'd love it. When I presented it to them, they glanced at it briefly before setting it aside to focus on Nick opening his shiny new toy train set. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me. It was the first time I felt truly invisible. By the time I was 16, I'd realized my place in the family had changed. My parents barely acknowledged me, unless it was to scold me. Nick, on the other hand, was their pride and joy. He excelled in school, aced tests, and even started winning awards. My parents doted on him, fulfilling his every wish, no matter how extravagant. Meanwhile, I was left to fend for myself. Despite everything, I tried to keep my head down and focus on my studies. I was close to finishing high school and had dreams of going to college. But when I brought this up to my parents, they shot me down. "College? For you," my dad scoffed. "You're not cut out for it. We need to save that money for Nick's education." They suggested I get a job at a fast food joint to help support the family and Nick's future. Furious and heartbroken, I refused. An explosive argument followed, and in a moment of desperation, I turned to my grandparents for help. They sided with me, which only enraged my parents further. They accused me of being ungrateful and disloyal. Then, they disowned me. I'll never forget that moment. My father's words were cold and cutting. "You're no longer welcome in this house. Don't come back." At 17, I moved in with my grandparents. They were kind, understanding, and supportive. Around this time, my love for cars resurfaced. I'd always been fascinated by engines and spent hours sketching car designs as a kid. With my grandparents' encouragement, I got a job as an assistant at a local auto repair shop. The mechanic who ran the shop, Mr. Bennett, became a mentor to me. He saw potential in my work and suggested I consider studying automobile engineering. Working at the shop was more than just a job. It became a refuge. I remember spending late nights there, tinkering with old engines and asking Mr. Bennett endless questions about how cars worked. It was during those moments that I found a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I felt like I was good at something. For the next 3 years, I juggled work and saving up for college. At 20, I finally had enough to enroll in an engineering program. The day I got my acceptance letter was one of the happiest moments of my life. I shared the news with my grandparents and Mr. Bennett, who were thrilled. In a moment of naive optimism, I decided to visit my parents to share the news. I knocked on their door, hoping for even a glimmer of pride. Instead, I was met with indifference. My parents made it clear they wanted nothing to do with me. "We're busy," my mother said, not even inviting me inside. As for Nick, who was 10 years younger than me, he didn't even come to say hello. I left feeling crushed, but resolved to move forward without them. College wasn't easy. I worked part-time jobs to cover expenses and poured every ounce of energy into my studies. There were nights I wanted to give up, especially when I tried reaching out to my parents and got no response. But my grandparents and Mr. Bennett kept me going. When graduation day finally arrived, I sent my parents an invitation hoping against hope they'd come, but they didn't. Only my grandparents were there, cheering me on as I walked across the stage. Their support meant the world to me, but deep down, I felt the sting of my parents' absence. After college, I started working at a prestigious automobile company. My years of hard work had paid off, but my parents' rejection lingered in my mind. Therapy became a crucial step in my journey to heal. I learned to accept that their love and approval were things I might never have. Nick, meanwhile, had taken a darker path. Despite his intelligence, he started using his skills for hacking and fraudulent activities. My parents, blind to his faults, supported him without question. They provided him with expensive gadgets and turned a blind eye to his misdeeds. At 19, Nick's actions caught up with him. He was arrested for a major cybercrime operation. My parents were desperate, scrambling for ways to get him out. That's when they reached out to me after years of silence. They begged me to help pay for Nick's bail and legal fees. I listened to their pleas, but my mind was made up. I reminded them of how they'd treated me, how they'd abandoned me, and how they'd enabled Nick's behavior. "I'm sorry," I said, "but this isn't my responsibility." My parents continued to call, text, and even showed up at my workplace. But I stood firm and refused to spoil him just like my parent did. For once, I put myself first. Today, I'm at peace with my decision. I've built a life I'm proud of, surrounded by people who genuinely care for me. My parents' attempts to guilt me no longer affect me. And as for Nick, he remains in jail, a consequence of his own choices. Months later, I received a letter from Nick. He wrote from prison, apologizing for how he'd treated me. He admitted that our parents' favoritism had warped his sense of right and wrong. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. But as I read on, it became clear that his apology wasn't entirely genuine. He asked for money and hinted that he wanted me to advocate for his release. I didn't respond. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. This experience taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, respect, and mutual support. And sometimes, walking away is the best thing you can do for your own sanity.